Most people were taught that the Boer War, conflict of imperial pride. They learned of a clash between the mighty British Empire, stubborn Dutch-descended farmers on the South African veld. Textbooks tell a simple story: colonial expansion, strategic trade routes, and military arrogance. But if you turn away from the battlefield, Oz can open the gold ledgers of 1899. Far colder, more calculated truth begins to emerge. London did not send 500,000 imperial soldiers across the ocean, not merely for prestige or red ink on a map. London sent them, because the international money system itself was standing on the edge of a precipice. By the end of the 19th century, the global economy ran on a single, unyielding mechanism, behind the gold standard. And the beating heart of that system, Iris Rom, was the Bank of England. The strict rules of the gold standard, every British pound in circulation was legally backed by physical gold bullion, resting deep inside bank vaults. If the supply of physical gold dried up, it collapsed, and interest rates spiked, and international trade ground to a complete halt. And in the late 1880s, the largest untapped vein of high-grade gold on Earth, covered in a land London did not control. Deep inside the independent South African Republic, known as the Transvaal, lay the Witwatersrand. A massive geological formation, holding nearly 30% of the world's known gold reserves. There was only one problem for the British Empire. This gold was sitting directly under the soil of a fiercely independent Boer government, led by President Paul Kruger. Haver was not a banker. He was a deeply religious, conservative farmer statesman, deeply distrusted British financiers, and rejected London's economic dominance. Taxed British mining equipment, controlled the monopoly on dynamite, and established independent railroad lines to Portuguese East Africa, bypassing British ports and British tariffs entirely. The financial elites operating inside the City of London, this was not just a diplomatic annoyance. It was an existential threat to the British credit empire. While the gold was in the African soil, aside from the credit built upon it, had already been sold to European investors. Behind the scenes, a powerful alliance was forged. An alliance between colonial tycoon Cecil Rhodes and the deeply entrenched capital of N M Rothschild Sons. They realized that controlling the mines of South Africa was not just about extracting bullion from the earth. It was about securing the foundation of the entire British monetary system. Peaceful corporate takeovers failed, and diplomatic coercion stalled. Balance sheets demanded a military resolution. Over the next 3 years, guys from the British Treasury would spend over £220 million deploying 500,000 imperial troops to 2 small agrarian republics. They burned tens of thousands of homesteads, slaughtered livestock, and constructed the first modern concentration camps of the 20th century, where over 26,000 Boer women and children perished from disease and starvation, all to ensure that the gold of the Witwatersrand flowed directly into the vaults of the Bank of England. This is the undisclosed chapter of the Boer War. A war fought with British rifles, funded by public debt, and launched to guarantee the balance sheets, private mining syndicates, and global banks. Understand why British soldiers were dying in the dusty veld of South Africa. I have to look 6,000 miles away. Inside the quiet, mahogany-paneled rooms of the Bank of England, at Threadneedle Street. In the late 19th century, London was the undeniable financial capital of the world. The British Empire covered a quarter of the globe, but its real power was not just its Royal Navy. Power was the British pound sterling. Pound was accepted in every major port, Shanghai to Buenos Aires, as the ultimate medium of exchange. Why? Because of the Gold Standard Act of 1816. This law mandated that anyone holding a paper British pound could walk into the Bank of England and exchange it for a precise weight of pure gold. This convertibility gave international merchants absolute confidence in London's financial system. It allowed Britain to issue massive amounts of international credit, finance global trade, and underwrite foreign loans. But this system had a lethal vulnerability. It could expand only as fast as physical gold reserves grew inside Threadneedle Street. If gold reserves dropped, the Bank of England was forced to raise interest rates sharply, shrinking credit, paralyzing merchants, and threatening industrial collapse across the empire. By the 1880s, global trade was expanding at a staggering rate. Industrializing nations like Germany, France, and the United States were all adopting the gold standard, fighting a ferocious, unprecedented international scramble for gold reserves. The Bank of England was constantly operating on thin margins of physical metal. If a sudden drain of gold occurred, London risked a liquidity crisis that could shatter its banking dominance. Then came the news from South Africa. By 1886, on a bleak farm in the southern Transvaal, a prospector named George Harrison struck an outcropping of gold-bearing conglomerate rock. It was the birth of the Witwatersrand gold fields. Unlike the Australian or Californian gold rushes, which yielded loose dust in riverbeds, and was a massive, pipe-level subterranean ocean of gold ore, calculated to be the richest single mineral deposit on the planet. From financiers, the discovery was a double-edged sword. If that gold flowed into the Bank of England, London's financial supremacy would be secured for another half-century. If that gold fell under the control of a hostile foreign power, or was hoarded by an independent state, the gold standard itself could be cornered and weaponized against Britain. The ledger books of London had found their ultimate prize, and their greatest threat. The arrival of gold transformed the sleepy, pastoral South African Republic overnight. Thousands of fortune seekers, engineers, speculators, and laborers descended upon the high plateau. A sprawling, chaotic tent city sprang up, named Johannesburg. Within a decade, Johannesburg grew from a barren ridge into a booming industrial metropolis powered by steam engines, hot mills, and electricity. The native inhabitants of the land were the Boers, descendants of Dutch, French Huguenots, and German settlers who had fled British rule in the Cape Colony 50 years earlier during the Great Trek. They were rugged, deeply religious farmers, who wanted nothing more than to live according to their own biblical laws, far from the reach of the British Crown. Their president, Kruger, affectionately known as Paul or Uncle Paul, was the living symbol of Boer defiance. Kruger had participated in the Great Trek as a boy. He was a veteran of frontier warfare, a stern Calvinist, and a fierce defender of Boer independence. When gold was discovered, Kruger did not celebrate. He famously remarked, "Instead of rejoicing, you would do better to weep. For this gold will cause our country to be soaked in blood." Kruger's premonition was deadly accurate. Extracting gold from the Witwatersrand was not a job for individual miners with pans and shovels. The ore was low-grade and buried deep beneath hard granite rock. Extracting a single ounce of gold required crushing tons of stone, treating it with toxic potassium cyanide solutions. This required immense industrial machinery, capital, investment, complex corporate organization. Within years, the individual prospectors were bought out or forced out. The mines were consolidated into a handful of massive financial conglomerates. The men who controlled these conglomerates were known as the landlords. Flamboyant, ruthless financiers who spent their winters in London mansions, on their summers speculating on mining shares. These landlords cared nothing for Boer culture, farming, or local sovereignty. They viewed the Transvaal purely as a balance sheet. And they quickly ran into a brick wall of state regulation, posed by Paul Kruger. At the center of the corporate takeover of South Africa, stood one man whose ambition matched the size of the continent. Cecil John Rhodes. Oz had arrived in South Africa as a sickly teenager, and within 20 years, had built an unprecedented financial empire. He first monopolized the diamond fields of Kimberley, creating the De Beers Consolidated Mines, a separate cartel that controlled over 90% of the world's diamond supply. How did a young Englishman achieve such immense financial power? Through the backing of the most powerful merchant bank in human history, N M Rothschild Sons. Lord Nathaniel Rothschild, operating from New Court in London, quiet architect behind Rhodes' expansion. Rothschild provided the massive credit lines, Osram issued the corporate bonds, and rallied the City of London to finance De Beers. When the gold rush hit the Rand, Rhodes and Rothschild acted swiftly. In 1887, they formed Gold Fields of South Africa Limited. Rothschild bought massive blocks of shares, injecting millions of pounds into deep-level mining development. Rothschild, this was not mere stock speculation. The Rothschilds were the primary bullion brokers to the Bank of England. They refined the gold, hired the transactions, and maintained the stability of the European bond markets. Controlling the Rand gold mines meant controlling the primary source of liquidity, for the world's central banks. Rhodes, meanwhile, harbored grand imperial dreams. He envisioned a continuous swath of British territory, Cairo to Cape Town, connected by British telegraph lines and railways. He once famously declared, "I would annex the planets if I could." From Rhodes, private capital and imperial conquest were two sides of the same coin. He used his wealth to secure a royal charter for the British South Africa Company, hunting him a private army, conquer the lands north of the Transvaal, which he promptly named Rhodesia. By 1890, Rhodes was elected Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. He was now simultaneously a head of state, a mining tycoon, chartered company director, and a representative of London's highest financial houses. Only one obstacle stood between Rhodes and total hegemony over southern Africa: Kruger's South African Republic. Kruger understood the game the landlords were playing. He saw that the foreign workers, whom the Boers called Whitelanders, were flooding into Johannesburg by the tens of thousands. By 1895, the Uitlanders outnumbered the native Boer citizens in the Transvaal. Kruger granted them immediate voting rights. From the Uitlanders would vote to hand the Republic's sovereignty to Britain. Kruger responded by raising the residency requirement for full citizenship, to 14 years. Lords raised a furious outcry, claiming their workers were being denied basic democratic rights. In truth, the landlords did not care about democracy for working-class miners. What they cared about was the cost of production. Kruger's government imposed heavy taxes and state monopolies to ensure that the wealth of the mines benefited the Boer state. Most notorious was the dynamite monopoly. Every pound of explosives needed to blast deep-level gold veins had to be purchased through a state license concession, inflating the cost of dynamite by over 20% and channeling millions into the Transvaal treasury. Kruger also imposed high tariffs on railway freight, coming from British-controlled ports in Cape Town and Natal. Free of British economic encirclement entirely, Kruger financed the construction of the Netherlands South African Railway Company, NZASM. The line ran eastward to Delagoa Bay, Portuguese-controlled Mozambique. For the first time, Transvaal could export its gold and import European machinery, weapons, and manufactured goods, without paying a single shilling in tax to the British Empire. Even more alarming to London was Kruger's diplomatic maneuvering in Europe. Kruger began cultivating close ties with Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. German banks began investing heavily in Transvaal state loans. German industrial firms supplied state-of-the-art Krupp artillery and Mauser rifles to the Boer armed forces. The City of London realized that time was running out. Transvaal retained its independence, an economic superpower in Africa, backed by German capital and armed with European weapons. Auld of the Rand would no longer guarantee the British pound. It would guarantee the German mark. Osram for Cecil Rhodes, the Bank of England, and the British Colonial Office, status quo was no longer tolerable. The independent Boer Republic had to be liquidated. By late 1895, Cecil Rhodes decided that if diplomacy could not bend Kruger, Allied force would break him. Working in absolute secrecy, Oz organized a corporate coup d'etat. Conspiracy was hatched at his luxurious estate, Shewer, near Cape Town, and was simple, restless, and treasonous. First, the Uitlander leaders in Johannesburg, organized as the Reform Committee, would declare a staged rebellion, citing intolerable oppression. And a private military force of 500 armed men, paid by Rhodes' chartered company, would launch an invasion from the border town of Pitsani on hard toward Johannesburg under the guise of rescuing helpless women and children. Once the fighting started, the British High Commissioner, Hercules Robinson, would step in to restore order, annexing the Transvaal under the British flag. Operation was financed directly out of corporate accounts. Consolidated gold fields and De Beers funneled tens of thousands of pounds into purchasing Maxim machine guns, rifles, and ammunition, selling them into Johannesburg inside oil drums and coal trucks. Jones's close personal friend and administrator, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, chose to lead the invading force. Back in London, the British Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, got fully informed of the plot through secret telegrams. Chamberlain gave his tacit approval, insisting only that the raid happen quickly, and look like a spontaneous uprising. On December 29, 1895, Jameson crossed the border into the Transvaal without warning. It was an unmitigated disaster. The Uitlander population in Johannesburg did not rise up. Mining bosses were divided, and the working miners had no desire to die for Rhodes' profits. Kruger's intelligence service had tracked every move of the conspiracy. Commandos, armed with accurate hunting rifles, ambushed Jameson's column at Doornkop. Outmaneuvered and surrounded, Jameson surrendered his entire force on January 2nd, published from 1896. Jameson raid was exposed to the world as a criminal, corporate-sponsored invasion. Kruger turned Jameson and his conspirators over to the British authorities for trial, winning immense moral standing on the international stage. Rhodes was forced to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in disgrace. Kaiser Wilhelm II sent his famous Kruger telegram, congratulating the Boer president on defending his nation's independence without appealing to the help of friendly powers. The raid had failed on the ground. But inside the corridors of power in London, it proved one decisive point. Private corporate plots were insufficient to take the Rand. Only the full, devastating force of the British Imperial Army could get the job done. When the British Parliament voted to approve military operations in the fall of 1899, Cabinet assured the nation of a swift, inexpensive victory. The War Office officially estimated the entire military campaign would cost roughly £10 million, thus assuring the public that a force of 40,000 soldiers would easily crush the Boer militia, and return home by Christmas. It was one of the most catastrophic, illusionary financial miscalculations in modern military history. Ours were not an untrained, disorganized peasant mob. Oxermen, they were expert marksmen, highly mobile on horseback, deeply familiar with the rugged African terrain, and equipped with state-of-the-art, powder, Mauser rifles, and long-range Krupp artillery purchased directly from Germany. Within 2 months, the war turned into an unprecedented nightmare for the British Imperial Army. During the infamous Black Week of December 1899, British forces suffered 3 humiliating, bloody defeats in rapid succession: Stormberg, Magersfontein, and the Battle of Colenso. Over 3,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded in a matter of days. The British Empire was shocked to its core. The war would not take 3 months. Awesome, it would take 3 long, Ostrom, exhausting years. The army would not consist of 40,000 men. It would swell to over 500,000 imperial troops. The total bill would not be 10 million pounds. Ostrom, it would rocket past 222 million pounds.